Hello, good evening, everybody. Happy Monday to you all. Yes, it's a Monday, not a Wednesday. You've got that right. We're going live on a Monday, and that's because there was some breaking news today that I really felt compelled to come on here and chat about a little bit because I know it's a case that people had been following closely ahead of time. But then something very bizarre happened on Friday that caught a lot of people's attention and actually raised a lot of anxiety in people who had been following this case closely. And then we had some breaking news on that same case this morning. So I said, you know what? Let's just do a quick 30 minutes, talk about what happened, all the twists and turns that this case took, and kind of wrap this whole thing up instead of waiting till Wednesday to talk about it or waiting even till Friday for us to do our weekly wrap up. We will talk about it again on Friday, I'm sure, but it's a case I think worth discussing a little bit this evening. So hello to everybody. Plenty of people in the chat already. Some familiar names: Farm Girl, Alicia K. Mayo, Pokemom, Robin Hood. Thank you guys so much. What a week it's going to be. Yes, that is very, very true. And of course, the case I'm talking about is Daniel Penny. He was, if you haven't heard already, found not guilty this morning. I am going to say that from my own kind of personal perspective and opinion, in watching the evidence in this case, I think that was the right decision. And I know that this case has a lot of people very heavily divided. A man lost his life. That is always a tragedy. And people feel very strongly about it, but I think it was the right thing. But before we even got there, it's not so much the verdict that's surprising to me. It's how we got to this verdict, and actually the things that took place before this verdict that makes this verdict even more surprising. And that was a bunch of gobbledygook, but I will try to explain what I mean by that. In other words, while we may have expected some sort of verdict today, I don't think I was expecting a not guilty verdict based on what the jurors told us on Friday. And I'm going to walk through what all of that meant. I think they got it right, but I also think it demonstrates that the jurors may have thought about it over the weekend, and some of them may have actually just changed their minds on things. So we'll get into all of that. But first, for those of you who have not been following this, this is the quickest of quick versions. This case involves a man by the name of Daniel Penny, who was a military veteran. He was a Marine. He was on a subway in New York. A gentleman by the name of Jordan Neely got onto that same train, who was a homeless person who was experiencing some sort of what I'll call mental crisis. And by accounts of several people who were on that train, he starts shouting and acting aggressively and threatening and saying things like, "I don't care if I go to jail. I don't care if I die." And it scared the hell out of people on that train. And Daniel Penny got up and restrained this man. And the way that he restrained him was to put him into what's been characterized as a chokehold. If you want to call it a chokehold or a restraint or whatever it is, he had his arm around the man's neck to some extent, and he was holding him down. And the man was struggling. Neely was struggling for several minutes. And tragically, after paramedics and first responders and police arrived, it wasn't even at the time that they arrived, but sometime later, Jordan Neely died. Oh, DK, thank you so much for becoming a member. Appreciate that. And the prosecutors in New York took a look at this and then decided to charge Daniel Penny with both manslaughter and what they call negligent homicide in New York, which is a lesser included of manslaughter. And this got a lot of attention because a lot of people felt that Daniel Penny was being made an example of. And I think he was. And I think that there were other things at play other than the prosecutors just trying to decide, was this the right thing to do or not? Which, as a former prosecutor, if you know my background, I was a prosecutor in the DA's office here in Los Angeles for 10 years. As a prosecutor, that bothered me when externalities, things other than the facts and the evidence, play a role in the decision the prosecutors are making. And I think that took place here. Daniel Penny It is alleged, and this is because they have videotape, held the man down for 6 minutes. During this trial, they called 40 witnesses. This was not a small trial. This was not a quick, let's just put on some evidence, see what the jurors think. They put on a hell of a case, the prosecution. 40 different witnesses were called. But what they did is they conceded, first of all, that Jordan Neely was a threat. Whenever you're dealing with a self-defense case, and that's what this is, there's always the question of reasonableness. And is it reasonable? First, question number one, is it reasonable to perceive what was taking place by the victim, by Jordan Neely, as a threat? The prosecution conceded that. Yes, he was a threat. It was reasonable to view him as a threat. They conceded that it was reasonable for Daniel Penny to respond to that threat by the use of force. He didn't pull a gun, he didn't pull a knife, but he responded by restraining the man. Where they say it turned from reasonable to unreasonable, and therefore from, quite frankly, heroic to criminal, was in the last 90 seconds or so. That he just simply held on to him for too long. And in holding on to him for too long, not only did that turn from reasonable to unreasonable and heroic to criminal, it turned into something that this man could be looking at 15 years in prison. Okay. That all played out. A lot of you followed this case pretty closely. Unfortunately, it was another one of these cases where cameras were not allowed inside the courtroom. So we don't know as much about what took place during that trial as we might have liked to have known. The other thing that took place is the experts were called during that trial. There was an expert by the prosecution and an expert by the defense. The expert by the prosecution said one of the silliest things I think I've ever heard an expert say on the stand. And that was when being questioned about drugs that Neely may have had in his body. This medical examiner arrived at the conclusion this was a homicide without considering any kind of toxicology report, saying that it would not matter in her conclusion, in her opinion, that Jordan Neely could have had enough drugs in his system to, quote, put down an elephant, and that would have not changed the opinion that it was in fact Daniel Penny that was responsible for his death. Putting aside everything else in this case, that is a patently ridiculous statement for a scientist to make, ever. They are supposed to be objective. They are supposed to be scientific. They are supposed to have no dog in the fight. And to make a statement like that is just ridiculous to me. The defense called an expert who said that there were other things that could have caused Neely's death. He did have drugs in his system. He did have medical conditions, that all of those could have contributed or been the actual reason for why Mr. Neely tragically lost his life. Okay. All of that's put on. We then arrive at Friday, and the jurors start to deliberate. And one of the questions that they had was about the definitions of recklessness and negligence. And at the time when we were talking about this case, I didn't give it a whole bunch of thought that they were asking about that, because those are important questions. But now in retrospect, they seem to take on a different life and meaning, because recklessness is the central issue in the manslaughter case, and negligence is the central issue in the negligent homicide case. And if they're asking for those definitions, I think one way to read those cards, to read those tea leaves, is to believe that there were jurors who felt that neither one of those had been met, and that the definitions of both of those were important, because there were people who probably felt, and we now know for sure, that this was justified. And this goes back to an idea that I've said many times before. This was a tragedy. Anytime somebody loses their life, I think we can all agree it was a tragedy. That man didn't deserve to lose his life. No one wanted him to lose his life that day. Daniel Penny didn't want him to lose his life. He just wanted to protect the other people on the subway. But not all tragedies are crimes. And not all deaths, even deaths at the hand of another person, are murder. And that's where we end up here. That sometimes a quote-unquote homicide, meaning a death at the hands of another person, is justified. And that is what the jurors told us about this case today. And I think rightfully so. So them asking that question about negligence and recklessness probably should have given us more of a clue, should have given me more of a clue when we were considering that way back then. So they come back on Friday and they say, Your Honor, we're hung. We're deadlocked. The judge gives them what is, we all know now is referred to as the Allen charge or Allen instruction, which is basically an instruction that says, no, you're not. Go back and think about it some more. You're not really hung. You're the best person. You're the best group of people to decide this case. Don't pass the buck. Handle this yourselves. Blah, 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 blah. Pressure, pressure, pressure. Please come to a verdict. They come back later that same day and say, sorry, didn't work. We're still deadlocked. Now, then this is when all of the kind of tomfoolery took place. Thank you so much, Laura. That's very generous of you. There were two charges here, charged in the alternative for the same conduct, the manslaughter, and then what we're going to refer to as the lesser included of involuntary or of negligent homicide. And an instruction was given to the jurors, and it was a little bit difficult to understand, but we're going to take a quick look at it right now. And I'm going to see if I can zoom in on this a little bit better. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So manslaughter in the second degree, that is the crime charged. If you find the defendant guilty of count 1, manslaughter in the second degree, do not consider and do not render a verdict on count 2, criminally negligent homicide. Very straightforward whenever you have a lesser included. You don't move on and find the person guilty twice. If you find them guilty of the greater charge, that's it. If you find the defendant not guilty of count 1, however, manslaughter in the second degree, for the reason that the people have failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant was not justified. In other words, if you find them not guilty because it was a justified homicide and self-defense did apply, that's game over. You don't even consider count 2 because justified homicide or self-defense applies to count 2 as well. And you must find the defendant not guilty of that count. So therefore, if it's justified, you move, it's game over. But if you find the defendant not guilty of count 1 manslaughter for this reason other than that, for some element, you don't feel it was reckless, but you do feel it was negligent. In other words, that's the only thing it could be. You're trying to decide between recklessness and negligence. Then proceed to consider and render a verdict on count 2. Okay. So they say they're deadlocked. No one knows why are they deadlocked. No one knows, are they deadlocked because it's justified? No one knows, are they deadlocked because they can't decide between recklessness and negligence? No one even knows which way they're leaning on any of this. And something happened that I've never seen happen and that troubled me greatly at that point. The judge then said, or actually it was the people said, well, Your Honor, if they're hung on count 1, and that means they can't get to count 2, let's just dismiss count 1 and allow them to consider count 2. That's not the way it works. And there's a few reasons for that. One, if you're the prosecution, you don't want that, because if they're hung on count 1, you want a mistrial declared so that you can retry that person on count 1 if you feel that that is the appropriate charge. If you're the defense, you're saying, no, that's not the way it works. You don't get to just charge the most serious thing you can think of. And if that ends up failing at the 11th hour, then just go ahead and dismiss it and move down the line in the lesser included till you find something that sticks. That's not the way how justice is done. That's not how the sausage is made. This was very troubling to me. It sets a very bad precedent. And though we didn't have cameras inside the courtroom, the reporting from inside the courtroom was even more troubling because it seemed like nobody was citing any sort of case law to support this idea. But the judge just said, I'm going to go ahead and take a chance. Well, they did take a chance. And that blew up in the face of the prosecution spectacularly. I think, that it was justified, or pardon me, that they were hung on between recklessness and negligence, and therefore they were going to convict him, and we don't want to go through this whole retrial again. So let's go ahead and convict this man now. And that is, to me, seeking a conviction rather than seeking justice. Think about this too. And thank you so much, Blackwater. Think about this too. You asked the jurors to consider this charge. You told a man that you intended to send him to prison perhaps for 15 years. But all of that somehow becomes not important to you at the 11th hour, when it becomes far more important to walk away with writing a G in the column, a W, rather than seeing justice done. If you really feel that this man was guilty of manslaughter, then just go ahead and do a retrial. DK, thank you so much. That is very generous of you. It says the ADA recommending dismissal of the top charge seemed improper, especially not quoting any case law. 100% agree. My mind was blown with the judge nonchalantly went along with it. 100% agree. ADA wanted win, not justice. This is exactly, D, you're making the point I'm trying to make, and you're just putting it in less words and more succinctly. But yes, 100%. This is just let's get a win. Let's put a check mark in the win column and walk away from this. If you feel, and this is part of a prosecutor's job, is to be that gatekeeper. If you are going to put people's lives in jeopardy by prosecuting them for something as serious that can put them away for 15 years, you better believe in it. And if you don't believe in it to the point that you're willing to dismiss it at the 11th hour just to get a conviction, that I think sends a really, really poor message to everyone. So what ended up happening? Well, we went into the weekend on a Friday thinking they're going to come back, and I thought they're just going to be hung again. I thought that some of the people who were voting for not guilty were not voting for not guilty because they had a problem between negligence and recklessness. They were voting for not guilty because they felt that he was justified and there was no crime here at all. And if they feel that way, they're going to feel that way about both counts. And just because it's now a lesser count, they're going to come back and say, we've stuck to our guns, and we would have a deadlocked jury. But what did we have instead? Instead, they come back and they say, we have a verdict, Your Honor. No need for further delay, no need for further instructions, no need for all of this nonsense and circus to take place. Put away your case law and motions. We have a verdict. And that verdict was not guilty. That ends it. Game over. No room for appeal, no second guesses, no instructions. Game over, not guilty. Now, what does that indicate to me? I do not believe that the people who were on the fence or battling about Daniel Penny being guilty of manslaughter felt that that same man was innocent, not guilty of negligent homicide. I think that they went over the weekend and they said, I'm done with this. And they either said, I'm done with it because I'm done with the games, or I'm done with it because I'm done. The judge and the prosecutor don't even seem to care. They've withdrawn the more serious count. Or maybe they rightfully said, I've reconsidered my position, and you know what? This was justified. And had I had more time to deliberate, I probably would have felt that it was justified on the more serious count. But boy, did this spectacularly blow up in the prosecution's face. Uncivil Law says, I did like the part where they cited no case law. Making up law as they go along is so exciting. How fun. I hope that that is, with all sorts of sarcastic quotes around it, Uncivil Law, because I agree with you. This isn't the Wild West, and we don't shoot from the hip when it comes to people's lives. And that's exactly what was taking place. It was just kind of like, oh, that sounds like an interesting idea. Why don't we go ahead and try that one out? Let's go ahead and just withdraw the problem here, remove the more serious count, and see if we can't get a conviction out of this case. Not the way it's done. And so just so we know what the prosecution gambled with, let's assume for a moment that the prosecution really cared that this was a manslaughter case and this was deserving of putting someone in prison for 15 years. By withdrawing that, they've already had double jeopardy attached. They cannot retry him on that again. And now he's been acquitted. So they don't even get a chance to retry him on anything. Had they just said, you know what? It's a hung jury. That's the way the cookie crumbles. That's the way these things end up. Sometimes you need to just saddle up and do everything all over again, and we're going to do it all over again. They would have, think about this, they would have been able to put him on trial for manslaughter again. Instead, now they're left with zilch and nothing. I think this is the right conclusion. But if you're the prosecutor, this isn't obviously the conclusion you were looking for. Let's take some questions. One last point on this whole thing. Without a conviction, there is no appeal. The prosecution cannot appeal what just took place. That is a verdict by the defense for the defense, and it's game over. Without a appeal, pardon me, we will never have a determination as to whether or not what the judge and the prosecutor did at the very end there was right or wrong. And that is a problem, because I would hate to see prosecutors across the country starting to do this kind of stuff. When I was a prosecutor, the job was always, can you prove it beyond a reasonable doubt? That's it. I mean, no, that's not only it. It's also, is it the right thing to do? Have we considered all the collateral consequences? Is this in the pursuit of justice? But end of the day, if you felt, despite the odds, despite the difficulties, despite the trouble, this was the right thing to do, and you can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, then that's what you charge, and that's what you go to trial on. Now, prosecutors might feel, well, we know we've got taking this situation as just an example, we know we've got a negligent homicide in the bag if they felt that way. But let's go ahead and charge the manslaughter, the more serious thing, just to see if it sticks, just to see if we can't get lucky on jury selection, just to see if we can't convince a couple of these rubes to go along with it. And if it fails, and if they hang and they're deadlocked at the end, we just dismiss it and we move on to the more easy charge to prove. Not the way justice should be done. It's exhausting to think about. I feel exhausting talking about it. Let's hear some of the questions that you guys have on this. Thoughts on the civil suit? This probably should have been a civil suit to begin with. I don't have a problem with the civil suit. Again, a civil suit's a court of law, and where many of these problems are hashed out, and it's where you hash out something that is not criminal. And this, in my view, was not criminal. It was awful and a tragedy, and somebody lost their life. And if you want to say that Daniel Penny was civilly negligent in the way that he handled that situation, go for it. It's a much lower standard of proof. It's a preponderance of the evidence, which just means more likely than not. It's not beyond a reasonable doubt. And most importantly, it's not going to deprive this man of his liberty. And so, they're going to pursue it and have at it. That's fine. Sometimes that's how these things are handled. I, again, think that Daniel Penny should probably prevail on that, because, again, not all tragedies are criminal, and not all tragedies are you civilly negligent. But I'm no expert on that kind of stuff as I am on the criminal stuff, so I'll let them have their day in court. Michelle says, does this mean they can drop some charges in the future in New York? That's my question too. I don't know. What kind of a precedent are they setting here for moving forward? Will New York prosecutors, realizing that at least one judge agreed with this, or will prosecutors in other jurisdictions, realizing that somewhere along the line somebody's gone along with this, decide to go ahead and do this? That's why, to me, it was infuriating that nobody had any case law on it. And that usually means no one's ever tried it before, because they realize they can't do it. Or they just didn't have the time to find it. But I don't remember a situation where a case has been submitted to the jury. You can drop charges in the middle. If you feel like I didn't reach the burden, the judge can drop charges. There's a motion that the defense makes after the prosecution's case where they ask the judge to drop the charges before it even goes into the defense case, saying they haven't met their burden. Sometimes those are granted by a judge. But by the time it's been submitted to a jury, it's hands off, it's game over. Hey, Jimmy. Jimmy says, did the judge violate a law dropping that count one? I think so. I just can't tell you what that law is. I think it has more to do about due process, if I had to guess. I think it has to do, you are entitled as a person charged with a crime to know what you're charged with so that you can adjust your defense to that. If you start changing things when it's already in the juror's hands and the defense can't make any arguments to respond to that with the jury, you've taken away some of their due process. Part of being put in the peril of the government is understanding exactly what you're charged with, so you know exactly what you should be defending yourself of. And if that can all be changed by the time it goes to a jury, then we've got some real problems. All right. Do we have any? Here we go. Is there usually an appeals attorney in the courtroom? No. Great point, DK. When appeals attorneys start showing up in the courtroom, something very wrong has gone on. I have had to call, when I was a prosecutor, our appellate office and say, I need you to show up to court, because that's usually means that we found ourselves so far afield in a problem and we need somebody who's an expert on all of this stuff. And that's what happened in this case. And I'm glad you brought that up, D, is that they had to bring in the head of appellate for New York to come in there to stand there. And I guess, by the way, didn't quote any case law as far as I'm concerned, just with wearing the robes of their own authority of being the appellate head of appellate, which probably just means that they stayed around till they got the promotion and everybody else left. Wearing that authority said, go ahead, judge. I think that you can do this. It's more on the judge, though. If you want to point any of the blame, the judge should know better and say, I'm not doing a thing until you guys bring me a case. I'm not going to, right now, I know I've done everything right. To disturb this and start doing something abnormal now without case law is going to create problems. And had he been convicted, I think that would have been appeal issue number one. We're getting towards the end of the hour, and I'll take more questions as we can. But I wanted to tell you about something special that we're doing right after this. At the top of the hour, we are doing a premiere in the latest episode of our Courtroom Confidential conversation series, which you guys have enjoyed so much, and we've enjoyed doing. Tonight, we are going to be showing to you the interview that we did with Andrea Burkhart. Really interesting stuff. Did you know that she was also a boxer, by the way? Well, now you do, and you'll get to hear all about that. And so if you stay on this channel after we are finished with this live stream, just hang tight for a moment, and it will automatically scoot you over to that premiere. I will be in the chat. All of the moderators will be in the chat. And so you can watch that there. Do we have Kaylin's given me signals? Do we have any other questions? She's saying, hang on for 1 minute. She's screaming at me to hang on for 1 minute. Hold on. We have 1 minute. Yeah, I get it. All right. Let me see if we have any last questions then, or comments from anybody. I don't see any last questions. I see a lot of people being excited about Andrea. Here's one from Future, says, both charges were there, but jury could only go to count 2 unless unanimous on count 1. Jury hung on 1, so judge dropped, and they came back with only count 2 to deliberate. Yeah, that's exactly what took place. They got hung up on count 1, and that really is the way the case. And I'll stand by that, by the way, even though that was not the best result for Daniel Penny. Daniel Penny, by the way, his team ironically fought against this. They demanded their mistrial. They wanted a mistrial. They felt all along the way that this was the wrong thing to have been done by the judge. And despite all their protests, the judge went ahead and did it anyways. And it ended up being the biggest favor to Daniel Penny, because it ended up with him being acquitted on everything. And he goes home a free man, which in my view, and I think in the view of a lot of you watching, was probably the right thing to have taken place anyways. Are we good now, Kaylin? Kaylin's got a big smile on her face and 2 thumbs up. So sit tight, everybody. Premiere coming up soon. So great to see you all. Thank you for coming and checking in with me for just a few minutes ahead of time. Take care.